It was an ordinary morning in Willow Creek, the kind of day Lydia Adams had grown accustomed to since her retirement from teaching. The small town nestled between rolling hills and farmland seemed to move at its own peaceful pace, with the same familiar faces passing through the local bakery in town square each morning. Lydia, a 68-year-old former schoolteacher, had lived here all her life, quietly enjoying the slow rhythm of days filled with gardening, book clubs, and volunteering at the local library. Her life had been steady, predictable, and uneventful, at least until that fateful afternoon. The day began like any other, with Lydia sipping tea by her window, watching as neighbors went about their daily routines. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and nothing seemed out of place. That was until a plume of black smoke suddenly rose into the sky from the direction of the historic district. The sight caught Lydia's attention immediately, and her heart skipped a beat. "What on earth?" she muttered under her breath, grabbing her coat and stepping outside. She joined a few other concerned townspeople as they hurried toward the commotion. The fire was raging, consuming the old pharmacy that had been a staple in Willow Creek for over a century. The smell of burning wood filled the air, and panic spread quickly as flames licked up the sides of neighboring buildings. A crowd had gathered, but the fire trucks hadn't yet arrived. Lydia wasn't the type to stand by when there was trouble. For 40 years, she had been the town's beloved teacher, known for her calm demeanor, her wisdom, and her fierce protectiveness over the children in her care. Though she had retired a few years earlier, her sense of responsibility never left her. Today was no different. As she stood among the crowd, her thoughts raced. What could have caused such a fire? Could it have been an accident, or something more sinister? The old pharmacy had been a local treasure, run by Mr. Jenkins, a kind-hearted man who had been battling health issues for years. Lydia's heart ached as she thought about the possible destruction of not only his business, but also the town's history. Willow Creek was a close-knit community where everyone knew each other. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, where neighbors stopped by for tea unannounced, and where gossip traveled faster than the town's only newspaper. The town's historic district was a particular point of pride, with its charming brick buildings and antique shops, drawing visitors from surrounding areas. But on this day, the district was in chaos. As the fire raged, store owners frantically tried to salvage what they could, while others watched helplessly as flames consumed their livelihood. It felt as if the heart of the town was burning. Through the thick smoke and chaos, Lydia heard a faint, desperate cry, a child's voice. Without hesitation, she sprang into action, pushing her way through the crowd. "Someone help! There's a boy in there," a woman screamed, pointing toward the pharmacy. Lydia's blood ran cold. Without thinking, she ran toward the entrance, where the heat of the flames was almost unbearable. She could hear the child now, sobbing from inside. "Stay back, Lydia," someone from the crowd yelled, but she ignored them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pushed open the heavy door, smoke instantly stinging her eyes and lungs. Through the thick smoke, she saw him, a small boy, no older than 7, cowering behind the counter, his face streaked with tears. She recognized him as Tommy, the grandson of Mr. Jenkins. He had been visiting his grandfather that afternoon, unaware that disaster would strike. Lydia didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, grabbed the boy in her arms, and shielded him with her body as she made her way back through the choking smoke. The heat was intense, and every step felt like a battle, but Lydia's determination was unwavering. Finally, she stumbled out of the building, coughing and gasping for air, but with Tommy safe in her arms. The moment Lydia emerged from the burning pharmacy, a hush fell over the crowd. Then, all at once, there were cheers, gasps, and tears of relief. People rushed toward her, patting her on the back and praising her bravery. The fire trucks arrived just as Lydia collapsed onto the sidewalk, exhausted but unscathed. She handed Tommy to his tearful mother, who hugged him tightly, thanking Lydia over and over again. The townspeople crowded around her, calling her a hero. But Lydia, in her usual humble manner, waved them off. "I did what anyone would have done," she insisted, brushing off the praise. To her, saving Tommy was simply the right thing to do. As the flames were finally doused and the chaos began to subside, Lydia found herself quietly retreating from the attention. She didn't like the spotlight, and while people kept talking about her heroic act, she just wanted to go home and put the day behind her. Little did Lydia know, this was just the beginning. Her simple act of bravery had set in motion a chain of events that would change her life and the entire town of Willow Creek forever. The fire was no accident, and the truth behind it would soon drag Lydia into a web of corruption and danger she never expected. But for now, as she walked home, Lydia could only think of one thing: she had done what needed to be done. The rest, she believed, was out of her hands. The day after the fire, the town of Willow Creek was still reeling from the devastation. The historic district, a source of pride for the entire community, had suffered immense damage. The pharmacy was a total loss, along with several other businesses that had stood for generations. Families whose livelihoods depended on the small shops were suddenly left without work. The town felt hollow, the once vibrant center now charred and lifeless. The fire had displaced several families who lived in the apartments above the shops, and the town quickly mobilized to help them. Willow Creek, despite its small size, had always been a place where people took care of one another. Donations poured in, and neighbors opened their homes to those affected. A local committee was formed to organize a fundraiser, aiming to help the victims rebuild their lives and, hopefully, restore the heart of the town. Despite the outpouring of support, there was an undercurrent of tension. People whispered about how the fire had spread so quickly, destroying multiple buildings before the fire trucks had even arrived. The usual calm in Willow Creek was replaced with anxiety, and the community was left grappling with the sudden tragedy. For Lydia, life hadn't returned to normal. She found herself at the center of attention, much to her discomfort. People stopped her in the street, praising her bravery, asking her to speak at town meetings, and inviting her to be the face of the relief efforts. She smiled politely, but in her heart, she wanted to fade back into the background, to return to the quiet life she had before. But that was no longer possible. A few days after the fire, Lydia received a call from the town's mayor, Henry Williams, a well-meaning man, but someone Lydia had never particularly trusted. He had a reputation for being too focused on appearances, more concerned with the town's image than its deeper problems. "Lydia, we need your help," Mayor Williams said, his voice dripping with false charm. "The community fundraiser is next week, and it would mean the world to everyone if you could be our spokesperson. You've become a symbol of resilience after this tragedy, and I can't think of anyone better to lead this effort." Lydia hesitated. She wasn't comfortable with public speaking, especially in this situation. "I'm not sure I'm the right person for this, Henry," she replied. "There are plenty of others who could do a better job." "Nonsense," he insisted. "The town looks up to you now. It would be a great service to the community." Reluctantly, Lydia agreed, though her instincts told her to be wary. As the days passed and the fundraiser approached, Lydia began noticing odd behaviors from some of the town officials, particularly in how they handled the fire investigation. At first, it seemed like they were doing everything by the book, but small details started to stand out: closed-door meetings, hushed conversations, and the fire chief's reports being delayed without explanation. Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Unable to ignore her suspicions any longer, Lydia decided to dig deeper. She started by talking to some of the local firefighters, who were more than willing to share what they knew. What she found was alarming. There were inconsistencies in the timeline of the fire and the response. Some witnesses claimed they saw flames erupt from two separate locations at the same time, something that couldn't have happened by accident. And yet, the official investigation seemed to gloss over these details. The more Lydia uncovered, the more her concerns grew. It was becoming clear that the fire wasn't just a tragic accident. It may have been deliberately set. But by whom? And why? If it was arson, The implications were horrifying. Someone had risked lives, destroyed livelihoods, and torn apart the heart of the town for reasons that Lydia couldn't yet understand. As she pieced together the fragments of information, Lydia faced a moral dilemma. Should she come forward with what she had discovered? If she did, the town's fragile spirit could be shattered. The people were already struggling to recover, and accusing someone, especially someone in a position of power, of setting the fire could create chaos. But if she stayed silent, the truth would never come out, and whoever was responsible would escape justice. The weight of her decision was overwhelming. The town had already begun to look to Lydia for leadership, a role she had never sought but was slowly being thrust into. She had become the reluctant hero, the face of the town's recovery, and now people expected her to lead them through this crisis. But could she expose the truth without destroying the very community she had spent her life caring for? The fundraiser came and went, with Lydia delivering a heartfelt speech that moved the crowd. But even as she spoke of unity and rebuilding, her mind was elsewhere, turning over the questions that plagued her. What should she do with what she had learned? Who could she trust to help her uncover the full truth? The town continued to rally together, but Lydia knew it was only a matter of time before the simmering tension reached a breaking point. The whispers of corruption, of a deeper conspiracy behind the fire, were growing louder. And though she hadn't wanted this role, Lydia realized that the people of Willow Creek were looking to her, not just for comfort and leadership, but for answers. Her decision would not only define her own future, but the future of the town she loved. As the shadows of suspicion grew longer, Lydia steeled herself for the battles ahead. She would need to expose the truth, no matter the cost, even if it meant facing enemies far more powerful than she had ever imagined. The weeks following the fire in Willow Creek brought no sense of closure for Lydia Adams. The town continued its efforts to rebuild, but behind the scenes, Lydia's unease only grew. Her suspicions about the fire's origin gnawed at her relentlessly. Though the town seemed eager to move forward, Lydia couldn't shake the feeling that something darker lurked beneath the surface. Determined to get answers, Lydia began her own quiet investigation. She spent her days at the local library, combing through public records and news reports, hoping to find anything that might explain the discrepancies she had noticed. She compared old building permits, fire inspection reports, and property records. What she found left her unsettled. The buildings that had burned in the fire were all recently insured, with new policies taken out just months before the incident. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, but Lydia needed more concrete evidence. Her heart raced as she recalled the hushed conversations she had overheard between town officials in the days following the fire. One afternoon, while returning from the grocery store, she had seen Mayor Williams and Fire Chief Roberts standing outside Town Hall, speaking in low, hurried voices. She had instinctively lingered just within earshot. They'd got no reason to suspect a thing, the mayor had said, glancing around nervously. The payout will be substantial, Chief Roberts had added, his voice tense. We just need to keep this under wraps a little longer. Lydia's stomach had churned at the implication. She had quickly walked away before they could notice her, her mind racing with questions. That conversation had confirmed her worst fears, but she needed more proof before she could accuse anyone of such a heinous act. One evening, Lydia found herself at the town records office after hours. She had convinced the night janitor, an old student of hers, to let her in under the guise of needing documents for the fundraiser. With the dim light of her phone illuminating the stacks of files, she worked quickly, flipping through insurance documents, contracts, and private correspondences that connected the dots. And there it was, a clear link between Mayor Williams, Fire Chief Roberts, and several business owners who had suffered from the fire. They had been in financial trouble for years, and the fire was no accident. It had been meticulously planned, a way for these struggling businesses to collect the insurance money and for the town officials to take a cut. The plan was elaborate, cruel, and it had nearly cost lives. Lydia sat back in her chair, her hands trembling as she clutched the damning documents. The fire hadn't been a random tragedy. It had been a deliberate act of greed. This revelation changed everything. Her mind raced as she thought about the child she had saved, about the families who had lost their homes and businesses, and about the trust the town had placed in its leaders. The town had been betrayed. As the weight of the truth sank in, Lydia realized she was standing at a crossroads. If she came forward with what she knew, it would destroy the reputation of several prominent figures in the community, figures who had been trusted for years. It would plunge the town into scandal, unraveling the delicate recovery it was trying to make. People would lose faith in their leaders, and the small, close-knit community would be torn apart. On the other hand, staying silent would mean allowing the corruption to continue unchecked. The men responsible would go unpunished, and Lydia couldn't stomach the thought of letting them walk free, knowing the pain and suffering they had caused. But the consequences of speaking up were terrifying. She would undoubtedly face backlash, and the town might never recover from the scandal. Was she willing to bear that burden? Lydia knew she couldn't make this decision alone. She needed someone she could trust, someone who understood the complexity of the situation. That night, Lydia called her closest friend, Margaret, a fellow retired teacher and the one person in town who had always stood by her side. They sat in Margaret's cozy kitchen, the smell of tea filling the air as Lydia explained everything she had discovered. Margaret listened intently, her expression shifting from shock to anger as Lydia laid out the evidence. "This is unbelievable," Margaret finally said, shaking her head. "How could they do something so monstrous?" "I don't know, but now that I know the truth, I don't know what to do," Lydia replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "If I go public with this, it could ruin the town. But if I stay silent, they'll get away with it." Margaret's face softened, and she reached across the table, taking Lydia's hand. "Lydia, you've always done what's right, even when it was hard. But you're right. This is a tough one. You have to think about the impact this will have, not just on those men, but on the entire town. People trust you. They look up to you now more than ever." Lydia sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. "I never asked for this. I just wanted to live a quiet life, Margaret. I don't know if I can carry this burden." Margaret squeezed her hand. "You may not have asked for it, but life has a funny way of putting us where we're needed. You've already saved lives, Lydia. But sometimes saving people means exposing the truth, no matter how painful it is." Lydia looked out the window, her mind racing. The town she had loved all her life was at stake, but so was her sense of justice. If she didn't do something, who would? And yet, if she went public, she could destroy everything the town had worked so hard to rebuild. "I just don't know what the right choice is," Lydia whispered, her voice breaking. Margaret looked at her with kind, understanding eyes. "Only you can decide that. But whatever you choose, just know that you'll have to live with it." As Lydia left Margaret's house that night, the weight of the decision hung heavier than ever. She knew that no matter what she chose, the town would be forever changed. The truth was now in her hands, and with it, the power to either expose the rot at the heart of Willow Creek or allow it to fester. Lydia's steps were slow as she walked back to her home, the cool night air brushing against her face. She thought about the people who had lost everything in the fire, the child she had saved, and the corrupt officials who had orchestrated it all. She also thought about the innocent townspeople who would suffer the fallout of a scandal they didn't deserve. Could she live with herself if she stayed silent? Or would the guilt consume her if she exposed the truth and destroyed the town she had called home all her life? As Lydia stood on her front porch, staring up at the dark sky, she knew one thing for sure. No matter what decision she made, nothing in Willow Creek would ever be the same again. The night after her conversation with Margaret, Lydia lay awake, grappling with her dilemma. Exposing the truth meant risking everything, but staying silent felt like a betrayal of the very values she had lived by her entire life. The weight of the decision was suffocating, and Lydia knew she couldn't carry it alone anymore. She needed help, someone who understood the dark underbelly of Willow Creek's politics, someone who had seen firsthand how corruption could fester beneath the surface. And there was only one person who fit that description: Jack Palmer. Jack Palmer was a name rarely spoken in Willow Creek anymore. Once a rising star in the town's local government, Jack had been ousted years ago after being falsely accused of embezzling funds. The accusations had come swiftly, and despite his protests of innocence, he had been scapegoated by the very officials who had quietly orchestrated his downfall. With his reputation destroyed, Jack had retreated to the outskirts of town, living a quiet, solitary life. Lydia had always believed Jack's innocence. She had watched his downfall from a distance, never involved enough to intervene. But now, years later, she wondered if he might be the key to unlocking the full truth about the fire. Jack had inside knowledge of the town's political machine, and if anyone could help her navigate the dangerous waters she was about to enter, it was him. Early the next morning, Lydia found herself standing outside Jack's modest home, a small cottage overgrown with vines and surrounded by untamed land. She hesitated, wondering if he would even agree to see her. After all, he had every reason to be bitter toward the town, to refuse any involvement in its affairs. But Lydia gathered her courage and knocked. The door creaked open, and there stood Jack, a man in his mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and a hard, weathered look that suggested the years had not been kind to him. His eyes narrowed when he saw Lydia. "Lydia Adams," he said, his voice gruff. "Didn't expect to see you here." "I didn't expect to be here," Lydia replied, her voice steady. "But I need your help, Jack, and I think you'll want to hear what I have to say." Jack studied her for a moment, then stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. As they sat down at his kitchen table, Lydia wasted no time. She laid out everything she had discovered: the fire, the corruption, the insurance scam, and the involvement of Mayor Williams and Fire Chief Roberts. Jack listened carefully, his expression growing darker with each passing moment. When Lydia finished, he leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. "So, the rot goes deeper than I thought," he muttered. "I always knew those bastards were dirty, but setting a fire, that's a new low." Lydia nodded. "I don't know what to do, Jack. I can't stay silent. But I can't bring this to light on my own. That's why I need your help." For a long moment, Jack said nothing, staring out the window at the wild garden beyond. Then he turned back to Lydia, his eyes hard with determination. "I'll help you," he said. "Not because I care about this town anymore, but because people like Williams and Roberts need to be stopped. And if we don't do something, no one else will." With Jack's help, Lydia's investigation took on new life. Jack had access to old records, connections to people who still worked in government, and most importantly, he knew how to dig where others wouldn't think to look. Together, they spent days gathering evidence, meeting in secret to avoid arousing suspicion. They discovered that the corruption ran far deeper than Lydia had initially thought. It wasn't just Mayor Williams and Chief Roberts. Several other officials were implicated, including members of the town council and local business owners. The fire had been part of a larger scheme to bail out failing businesses, funnel money into the pockets of the corrupt, and keep the town's elite in power. As Lydia and Jack pieced together the full extent of the conspiracy, the pressure began to mount. They knew that if they went public with this information, it would shake Willow Creek to its core. The town's faith in its leadership would be shattered, and the fallout would be catastrophic. But they also knew that they couldn't back down now. Too much was at stake. Just when they were ready to take their findings to the authorities, Lydia received an anonymous letter. It arrived one morning, slipped under her door with no return address. Her hands trembled as she opened it, and her heart sank as she read the chilling message. "If you know what's good for you, you'll keep your mouth shut. Walk away now, or you won't live to see the end of this." Lydia's blood ran cold. Someone new, someone powerful enough to send a threat this serious was watching her every move. The letter wasn't just a warning. It was a clear indication that whoever was behind the fire and the corruption would go to any lengths to protect themselves. She brought the letter to Jack that afternoon, her hand still shaking. Jack read it and swore under his breath. "Looks like we've rattled some cages," he said, crumpling the letter in his fist. "But this just means we're closer to the truth than they're comfortable with." Lydia felt a wave of fear wash over her. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about survival. If they moved forward, they would be risking their lives. The letter weighed heavily on Lydia's mind as she considered her next steps. Jack urged caution, warning her that whoever had sent the threat was dangerous and that they needed to tread carefully. But Lydia felt an even deeper responsibility to the people of Willow Creek now. The corruption they had uncovered wasn't just a political scandal. It was a moral affront, one that had nearly cost lives and was actively tearing apart the fabric of the community. Jack, sensing Lydia's inner turmoil, tried to convince her to take a step back. "Lydia, listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "We're in dangerous territory now. These people are willing to kill to protect themselves. If we go public, you could be putting a target on your back. You need to think long and hard about whether you're ready for that." Lydia met his gaze, her heart pounding. She had never been a person who sought out danger, but she had always believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The weight of the town's future pressed on her shoulders, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been put in this position for a reason. She had uncovered the truth, and now it was her responsibility to bring it to light, no matter the personal risk. "I can't walk away, Jack," Lydia said quietly. "These people have done too much harm. They need to be stopped." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "All right," he said finally. "But we're going to have to be smart about this. If they know we're onto them, we need to watch our backs. And if we're going to bring them down, we'll need solid evidence, something that no one can refute." Together, they began to plan their next move, knowing that every step they took brought them closer to both the truth and the danger that awaited them. The day of the town hall meeting arrived, and Willow Creek was buzzing with anticipation. Word had spread that Lydia Adams had something important to reveal, though no one knew the full extent of what was coming. The town hall was packed, standing room only, as people from every corner of the community gathered to hear what their local hero had to say. The tension in the room was palpable, with town officials sitting in the front row, their faces unreadable but their posture rigid. Mayor Williams and Fire Chief Roberts exchanged nervous glances as Lydia walked to the podium, clutching a folder of evidence she and Jack Palmer had painstakingly collected. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she knew this was a moment she couldn't back away from. Everything hinged on what would happen next. Lydia took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room filled with familiar faces, friends, neighbors, and even those who had doubted her over the years. She felt their collective gaze on her, the weight of their expectations pressing down. She cleared her throat and began to speak, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "Thank you all for being here," Lydia began, locking eyes with Mayor Williams, who looked away, fidgeting in his seat. "I've called this meeting today because there's something you all need to know, something that has been hidden from you for too long." A murmur spread through the crowd. Lydia continued, her voice gaining strength as she recounted the events leading up to the fire in the historic district. She spoke of the strange behaviors she'd noticed from town officials, the inconsistencies in the investigation, and the months of digging she had done to uncover the truth. "As much as I wish I could stand here and tell you the fire was an accident, I can't," Lydia said, her voice breaking through the rising tension. The fire was no accident. It was a deliberate act, orchestrated by people in positions of power within our own community. Gasps filled the room, but Lydia pressed on. She opened the folder and pulled out copies of the documents that laid bare the entire scheme. Insurance policies, forged reports, and emails between the corrupt officials. One by one, she named the culprits: Mayor Henry Williams, Fire Chief Roberts, and several other high-ranking town officials and business owners. Each name she spoke was met with audible shock from the crowd. "These men," Lydia continued, pointing to the stunned officials in the front row, planned the fire to collect insurance money and line their own pockets. They didn't care about the lives they endangered, the homes and businesses they destroyed, or the trust they shattered. They only cared about their own greed. The room erupted into chaos. People shouted in disbelief, demanding explanations from the officials, who sat frozen, their faces pale. Mayor Williams stood up, trying to maintain his composure, but his voice faltered. "This is outrageous. These are baseless accusations," he stammered, but the evidence Lydia had presented was undeniable. The crowd turned on him, voices rising in anger as the truth sank in. Lydia watched as the townspeople, many of whom had once supported Williams and the others, now looked at them with contempt. The tension that had simmered beneath the surface for so long had finally boiled over. The betrayal was too deep to ignore. Within minutes, the town's police, who had been quietly investigating alongside Lydia and Jack, moved in and arrested Mayor Williams, Fire Chief Roberts, and the others implicated in the scheme. The sight of the once respected leaders being led away in handcuffs was surreal for many. Some cried out in anger, others in disbelief. But the truth had finally come to light, and there was no turning back. In the days that followed the town hall meeting, Willow Creek was left reeling. The news of the arrests spread quickly, and the fallout was swift. The corrupt officials were charged with arson, conspiracy, and fraud, facing serious prison time. Investigations revealed even more layers of corruption, deepening the town's sense of betrayal. The community was divided. Many were grateful to Lydia for her courage and determination, recognizing that she had saved the town from further harm. She became a symbol of justice for those who had long suspected that something was wrong, but hadn't had the power to challenge it. But not everyone was on her side. Some people, particularly those who had been close to the corrupt officials, felt betrayed by Lydia's actions. They accused her of destroying the town's reputation, of stirring up trouble when they had been trying to move forward. Businesses that had been caught up in the scandal faced closure, and families were torn apart by the revelations. Willow Creek's once peaceful streets now hummed with the tension of a town grappling with the aftermath of scandal. Neighbors who had once been friendly now eyed each other with suspicion, wondering who had known what and for how long. For Lydia, the personal cost of exposing the truth became evident almost immediately. Some of her closest friends, people she had known for decades, began distancing themselves from her, unable to reconcile the woman they had once admired with the storm she had brought down on their town. The very people she had fought to protect now saw her as a controversial figure, someone who had upended their lives in ways they weren't ready to accept. One afternoon, while walking through the town square, Lydia overheard a conversation between two women she had once considered friends. "She's done more harm than good, if you ask me," one of them said, shaking her head. "I'm not sure the town will ever recover from this." Lydia's heart sank, but she kept walking, her chin held high. She knew in her soul that she had done the right thing, but that knowledge didn't soften the sting of being ostracized by people she cared about. The pain of losing those relationships weighed on her, but she took solace in the quiet support of those who understood the gravity of what she had uncovered. Jack, Margaret, and a few others stood by her, reminding her that sometimes the right path is the hardest one to walk. In the end, Lydia had become an unexpected symbol of controversy. To some, she was a hero, a champion of truth and justice who had saved Willow Creek from the clutches of corruption. To others, she was the one who had torn the town apart, exposing wounds that might never heal. Lydia, for her part, didn't see herself as either. She was just a woman who had done what she felt was right, no matter the cost. She had never asked for the spotlight, but she had stepped into it when it mattered most. And now, as Willow Creek began its slow journey toward healing, Lydia knew that the town's future, like her own, was uncertain. But she also knew that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth fighting for. Months passed after the scandal that rocked Willow Creek. The dust had settled, but the scars of the fire and the corruption it uncovered lingered in the hearts of the townspeople. Slowly, however, the community began the long process of healing. In the aftermath of the arrests, Willow Creek was left to pick up the pieces of its fractured identity. The town had been deeply shaken by the betrayal of its leaders, and for a while, there was a pervasive sense of mistrust. Yet from this dark chapter, a new chapter of hope and accountability began to emerge. New leaders stepped forward, people with integrity, transparency, and a genuine love for the community. They initiated reforms to prevent any future corruption from taking hold. Town meetings became more inclusive, and citizens were given a greater voice in the decisions that shaped their community. A watchdog committee was established, ensuring oversight on important financial matters. Lydia, though not directly involved in town politics, watched from afar as the town she had loved for so long began to transform. There was a new sense of vigilance among the people, and despite the lingering wounds, the community was slowly beginning to trust again. The businesses that had been destroyed in the fire were rebuilt, this time with the support of honest leaders who had the town's best interests at heart. As the seasons changed and the town moved forward, Lydia found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. Sitting in her quiet home, she often thought back to the moment when she had stood at the crossroads, unsure whether to expose the truth or keep silent. It had been the hardest decision of her life, but she knew deep down that it had been the right one. Lydia's life was no longer the peaceful, uneventful retirement she had envisioned, but she had come to accept the role she had played. People no longer saw her as just the kind, quiet retiree who volunteered at the library. She was now a symbol of courage and integrity, someone who had stood up against corruption, even when it would have been easier to look away. But it hadn't come without a cost. Some of her closest relationships had been damaged, and there were still those in the town who couldn't forgive her for exposing the scandal. Yet Lydia had made peace with that. She had always believed that doing the right thing didn't mean it would be easy, and she had been proven right. The town itself had changed in profound ways. The old way of doing things, the closed-door meetings, the shady deals, the backroom politics, was gone. In its place was a more open, honest community, where people felt they had a say in how their town was run. The spirit of unity that had always defined Willow Creek was slowly returning, though it would take time to fully rebuild the trust that had been shattered. Many of the town's residents, especially the younger generation, looked to Lydia as an inspiration. Her bravery in standing up to the powerful had become a source of pride for the town. People who had once been content to let things slide now demanded accountability from their leaders. There was a renewed sense of community, and though the pain of the past hadn't fully faded, there was hope for a better future. One crisp autumn morning, Lydia received a letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Curious, she opened it and began to read. To her surprise, it was from Mayor Henry Williams, now serving time in prison for his role in the fire and the corruption that followed. The letter was brief, but its contents were unexpected. In it, Williams expressed genuine remorse for his actions. He admitted that greed had blinded him, that he had lost sight of the values he had once claimed to uphold. He wrote about the burden of guilt he now carried, knowing that his actions had torn apart a town he had sworn to serve. "I don't expect forgiveness," the letter read, "but I needed you to know that I understand now the full weight of what I did. You were right to expose the truth, even if it destroyed my life. In doing so, you saved the town, and for that, I am grateful." Lydia sat quietly after reading the letter, her thoughts swirling. She hadn't expected this. For so long, she had viewed Williams as a villain, someone who had willingly sacrificed the good of the town for his own selfish gain. But now, reading his words, she saw a man who was deeply broken by his own mistakes. It wasn't full redemption, but it was a moment of closure that Lydia hadn't anticipated. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace about the choices she had made. The truth had come at a cost, but in the end, it had been worth it. As Lydia folded the letter and placed it in her desk drawer, she thought about the journey she had been on. From the quiet, unassuming life of a retiree to the center of one of the biggest scandals Willow Creek had ever seen, she had been tested in ways she never imagined. Before closing the story, she posed one final question to herself and to the community she had fought to protect. Would you risk everything for the truth, even if it meant losing those closest to you? What would you do? Lydia knew that the answer wasn't simple. Every person had to make that decision for themselves, but she hoped that by sharing her story, others might find the courage to do what was right, even when it was hard.